Hi there, it's Alexandra from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog. And do you find that weeds are the bane of your gardening life? I find I spend ages weeding and then I go out into the garden, they've all popped up again. But there is an easier way to do it. So I'm interviewing Jack Wallington, garden blogger and garden designer, whose latest book, Wild About Weeds, Designing with Rebel Plants, has just come out and has lots of advice in understanding weeds better and in incorporating weeds into your garden so that you're not fighting them the whole time. The basic principle is that there are some weeds that are really unacceptable. Ground elder, couch grass, bindweed and brambles, all of which are draping themselves around the middle-sized garden at this very moment. And I do need to take those out. But I can stop them from getting back again by introducing weeds and plants that are less invasive but will still do really well in that spot. Because if you've got a garden full of plants, there is less place for weeds to grow. Wild About Weeds is a fascinating book to read, and it will teach you much more about plants. Seeing plants grow in the wild is one of the best ways of understanding more about them, and actually weeds is something that we can see in the wild just when we walk down an urban street. I use a lot of self-seeded plants in my garden, and anyone who uses self-seeders will automatically have a lot of weeds because the gap between self-seeded plants and weeds is quite small. And of course there's a trend now for wildflower planting and wildflower meadows, and once again the difference between weeds and wildflowers is very small. Jack's book is very much in the trend of what's happening today, because this has been the year when I actually saw nettles lovingly planted in a show garden at Chelsea, and buttercups and long grass in this wonderful show garden, which I have tried to do in the middle-sized garden, but perhaps with less stylish success. So let's hear from Jack about how to make weeds work in your garden so that you can enjoy your garden more and fight the weeds less.
So the difference between a weed and a normal garden plant or a wildflower, I guess, is really just in people's own perceptions and in terminology, because really all plants are just plants and they grow in different ways depending on different environments. The old adage, a weed is a plant in the wrong place, is good, but I think in the book I dissect this a little bit, and I explore different reasons why some people might think a plant is a weed. And I kind of come to the conclusion, for gardeners, a weed is just a mind-numbingly annoying plant that won't go away because it self-seeds around the garden. I think what people find bad about weeds is they find them hard to control, because a weed will generally pop up where you don't want it, and it will start multiplying and spreading. You dig it out, and like a dandelion, you'll dig out the dandelion, its roots are so strong that it will pop back up again before you know it. So it pops up in paving and all around the place, all the places you don't want to plant. So I think that's what's frustrating for people, and they can start to crowd out the plants that you do like. Firstly, understand what weeds you've got. So go out to the garden and just look again at all of those plants that you find growing through the cracks in the paving or popping up in your beds, and just take time to look through the book that I produced or other weed books, or look online and identify those exact plants. Start to understand how they grow and what they'll turn into. So what looks like a leafy root might actually have a lovely flower later on in the year. And so really getting to understand them would be good. And some of them will be bad. Certain weeds that you wouldn't want in your garden will be things like green alkanet, bindweed, Japanese knotweed is obviously a no-go. And those are the plants which are not particularly attractive, but also will get out of control, and they are slightly hard to control. I think if you've got some problem weeds, one of the things you can do is outcompete those weeds with other weeds. So, for instance, if you do have stinging nettles, which aren't that bad, can make good compost, but actually aren't that attractive. If you bring in white dead nettle, which is like a stinging nettle but actually has really beautiful flowers and doesn't sting, then that's actually quite a vigorous plant and can start to outcompete the other stinging nettle. So and if you continue to attack the original stinging nettle by digging it out occasionally, the white dead nettle will take over and eventually they'll swap places. There are 3 options for very dry shade that I'd recommend. One would be ivy, which a lot of people really don't like, but actually is incredibly good in dry shade. And those sort of harsh conditions will actually keep it under control a little bit by being slightly, if it is really dry. Another one would be herb robert, which is a really nice, has really nice tiny small pink flowers, grows really well in part shade to slightly dense shade, but really likes dry conditions. That would be perfect. And the third one, you could try caper spurge, which is a euphorbia with really nice architectural leaves, and then that will turn into, in spring, then it creates a huge crown of quite glowing acid green flowers, which last for a good part of the summer. One of the big challenges people obviously have with weeds is keeping them under control, because you look away and the next minute they're growing all over the place. But one of the ways I keep them under control is just by growing more plants. So by growing as many plants as possible, it minimises the amount of bare soil, which is exactly the kind of space where weeds like to grow. So growing more large shrubs or large grasses will start to dominate an area and then reduce the amount of space where the weeds can grow. So that's one of the best ways of keeping them under control. So I think if you do have to weed, the two top ways I'd recommend weeding would be number one, just using a small hand fork and actually getting down, rather than using a larger tool like a large hand fork. I always find, unless it is a very large weed, but using a hand fork allows you to get down into the roots and pull out as many roots as possible without disturbing other plants around too much. So hand weeding is always good because you know what you've pulled out. The other one would be to use weed suppressant matting or cardboard just over an area, which isn't particularly nice to look at, but is very effective at stopping light getting into weeds. And so over the course of let's say half a year to a year, most weeds can be killed off just by covering areas. If you've got a particularly large area which has got a lot of weeds, one of the best ways is to cover it for 6 months to a year, maybe slightly more, and that will kill off a lot of the plants just by starving them of light. When we open our garden on the NGS National Garden Scheme, traditionally weeds are seen as a no-go for that, and actually we do have a lot of weeds in our garden intentionally. And when people come around, most people don't actually notice them because I think in a different setting, and when they're growing really well, they just look like ornamental plants. However, there have been a few people that have gone to rip out a weed that I've been growing, and I've had to stop them right there and then, just almost grabbing their hands, but in a polite way, to saying, no, this is a plant that, yes, it's a weed, but I really want it there. Some people really can't get past that, and they really warn me against it because it will spread around, but we have a conversation about it, and eventually they see my point, hopefully. As a garden designer, I've been sneaking weeds into all of the gardens that I've been working on. I probably shouldn't say that just in case some of my clients are watching, but I guess the point is all weeds actually are plants, and sometimes if they're in the right place, they can look beautiful. Some of them, some clients, when I first talk to them, I mention weeds, they panic and go, no, we don't want any weeds in the garden. Because one of the top briefs for a garden designer, I think, is low maintenance, minimising the amount of weeds. But actually, when I explain why I'm putting some in, and actually some of them can be beneficial for stopping other weeds, and then it starts to convince people. But I put lots of different things into shady situations, sunny spots, urban gardens, or bigger ones as well. In my garden, I've got a few core weeds which I like to grow. One of them is caper spurge, which is quite tropical. It's a small tropical garden. I'm also growing hart's tongue fern, growing out of cracks in the walls and steps. Various different mosses, ivy, purple toe flax, and a few others. What I hope Wild About Weeds will do for people, firstly, I hope people enjoy reading, and it's quite fun to understand more about weeds, but also to understand them so much that they feel confident to grow one or two. I don't expect people to grow an entire garden full of weeds. The book's not about that. It's about understanding one or two that you can just allow to dot around. So they bring the free spirit of a weed to kind of pop up around a garden, bring a garden to life a bit more with their easygoing nature, and also hopefully make gardening a bit easier because it's one more weed you don't have to pull out.
There are links to Jack Wallington's garden design blog and to Wild About Weeds, designing with rebel plants, in the description below. And if you've enjoyed this, please do hit like, because then I'll know you'd like to hear more about plants. And if you'd like to make your gardening life a bit easier and more enjoyable and have more success in the garden, then do subscribe to the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel for tips, ideas and inspiration. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.